October is here, and so is UCLA A week. Easy for me to say this morning. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel in the middle of UCLA week. Yes, we can only go up from here, T. Frank. Penn State, a nearly 4-touchdown favorite over the Bruins, who come to Beaver Stadium for the first time in a long time. These two teams last met in the 1960s. Penn State actually 2-4 all time against UCLA. Of course, none of those games were played when UCLA was a member of the Big Ten Conference, which it now is in year one of both that era in UCLA athletics and also the Deshaun Foster era of UCLA athletics. So a lot to get to today. Thanks for joining us as always, and your questions and comments help drive the show, as T. Frank says, after every single post-game or during every single post-game show, which you should check out here on the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel shortly after each Penn State game concludes if you're not already. T. Frank, good morning. How's UCLA week? Why and how did we get to October so fast? And how you doing?
Doing all right. UCLA week. I'm curious about this one. Obviously, we're going to talk about practice here in a second, but how they handle this game. Again, I don't want to be disrespectful of any individual opponent, but is this week more of a tune-up for USC than it is about UCLA? And that's going to be kind of where we if we have time, we'll get out of the show kind of previewing that. But of course, practice tonight, I think, is the most interesting thing. Although James Franklin coming out of the Illinois game, where I think a lot of people were determined to be happy about the performance, and I think that's fair because there were some strong indicators that Penn State fans have wanted for a very long time in terms of trench performance, domination, bully ball, playing an old school Big Ten style of football, but areas to develop. And James Franklin talked about wanting a significant step. I wrote about that, of where I think, based on his comments, he felt like they didn't take that step. So that's up at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com today.
T. Frank, Penn State will hold its usual Wednesday night open practice for the media. We'll get to see some drills and things like that early, right around dinner time for most. And then James Franklin will speak later tonight. So before we get into what we want to hear from James Franklin's second UCLA news conference of the week, I'm curious your thoughts on what you want to see when you get to practice. I have a weird suspicion. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I got a weird suspicion you might be taking a beeline straight to the offensive line as soon as you walk in.
Yeah, so they have been ultra consistent since the start of the season in terms of all the players in the 2 deep, not just the starters, have been exactly where we expect them to be. You've got Drew Shelton at left tackle all the way over to right tackle, where you have Anthony Donko, and on the backups, you've got Javen Williams all the way over to Nolan Rucci. So it's all been super consistent. Losing 2 guards last week shuffled things around during the game. James Franklin already talked about you expect to see Sal Wormley back. He did not mention JB Nelson.
Right.
I find that interesting because both those guys got the same injury based on my film study during the game. I was watching the game live. They got poked in the eye. Right. I don't know of anything else that happens to your face when somebody's hand goes to your face mask and then you crumple to the ground. Right. You didn't get poked in the nose for that to happen. Right. So is one worse than the other? Is JB Nelson back there? If we expect Sal Wormley to be back there, is he there? How does all that shake out? And who plays where in these situations? Because how that particular thing worked out from where Venga Ioane lined up, I think changed a little bit of the game from a performance standpoint. It's really hard to play both left and right in a season, left and right guard, left and right tackle, whatever it might be. I'm more and more impressed each week by the fact that he does it in a game, be able to play the left and the right side. And if things develop a certain way and you got to play Cooper Cousins, where is he most comfortable? I think those factors will determine a lot this week and this weekend against UCLA.
I see, David, you have a question here in the chat. We will get to that in our mailbag segment coming up here in a little bit. If you have a question, feel free to leave us one. We will get to as many as we can during that portion of the show. You know, another thing, obviously, when you talk about what you want to see at practice tonight, James Franklin also mentioning on the defensive side of the ball that Jalen Kimber, they're expecting to have back this week. He left the game against Illinois early. You're right. It was interesting. He didn't mention JB Nelson. I don't want to read too much into that, though. Right. But at the same time, it was interesting. There's no question about that. So Kimber will be another player that we keep an eye on out at the Penn State practice field tonight. And then, anything other than injuries you're looking forward to either seeing or maybe not seeing in terms of things you've seen from weeks past that maybe are not things that you would think that Penn State would prefer to see moving forward?
So the conversation about health is who's playing and who's playing at full strength. And we had that question, we had that conversation yesterday. And the difficulty is, take the receivers, where we saw Liam Clifford and we saw Caden Saunders practicing together, I think from week 1 onward. So they were there, but when everyone's going 80% and routes on air and making sure you're focusing on the details and you're not going full out, you don't get the same sense of who's healthy. And then we saw Caden Saunders try to return a punt, and you go, okay, so that is very different than we saw from him previously in the spring. How do you understand the differences? There was some players, it is a little more obvious. Khalil Dinkins looked rusty in his first week back, but then got back up to speed pretty quickly. Caden Saunders has looked fine, but has not been getting back up to speed the same way. So trying to understand those situations, are there any other bumps and bruises from this previous game that we are keeping an eye on or going to learn about this week? And then I think you want to talk about Quentin Martin and his spot on the depth chart, right?
Yeah, no question. So James Franklin, among the injury conversations he was having during his Monday news conference, confirmed that Cam Wallace, the third-string Penn State running back who was injured against Kent State late in that contest, does have a long-term injury. And so obviously Penn State came into this season thinking, or at least explaining to us their way of thinking, that they could use Quentin Martin Jr. and Corey Smith, the 2 freshman running back, kind of almost as one player as it would relate to playing each in enough games to get them experience, but not have either go over the 4-game threshold that would obviously, burn a year of eligibility for those guys. By the way, for the 3 guys, DeJuan Lane, Cooper Cousins, and Luke Reynolds, who were given the green light for burning a red shirt, they will do that this weekend against Illinois. So that was going to happen, obviously all the way back to August. That was the plan. Quentin Martin Jr., it certainly came off to me, T. Frank, like they were hoping to save his red shirt this season. Now with Cam Wallace out, is that a possibility? He has played in 1 game so far, so what will Penn State do here moving forward? We're not going to learn that completely on the practice field tonight, but we might get a sense for the direction it's headed.
Yeah, and that's another interesting thing each week about practices. Who's wearing a practice squad number? And who is wearing, a number that corresponds to a starter or role player for the opposing team. Tyseer Denmark has been somebody we have been watching week to week, and last week he was not in his number 4 jersey. So that how Corey Smith, I think specifically, plays into this conversation is important, because is he ready to take more snaps? Because they have not used Quentin Martin on special teams. I would assume that's it. The moment they decide they have to burn his red shirt, he's a major factor on special teams. But I guess it's more of a question, has Corey Smith developed to the point they feel comfortable using those guys in 4 games apiece? Because we haven't really seen Corey Smith do much from that perspective, moving up or down the depth chart. And I think part of that is Quentin Martin got here in January and was able to go through the Big Ten lifting program. Corey got here in the summer. I think it was it June or July, Greg, where he got here?
June. Sounds right.
Okay.
Him and Donovan Harbour got here at the same time out of Wisconsin. Yes.
Yeah, so that's just a shorter amount of time to get up to a Big Ten size. And if they feel like he's not ready, or maybe he's ready later, they might have to use Quentin Martin more often. I think that's just I don't think we're going to know that for another couple weeks, because this is an opportunity where you can probably get away with only playing one of them. And if you've already played Quentin Martin, you can put Corey Smith into the game and then kind of absorb some of those reps that way. But I genuinely don't know how that's going to go until we see the game. And if they get to a point where they can play the reserves more aggressively, right?
Yes, correct. And I think there's a chance that could happen. But it's also, again, when you talk about being in week 5 or game 5 rather of the 2024 season, you start doing the math of, okay, when can we safely use a guy's second game or use a guy's first game? And of course, if they need to do it, all that stuff goes out the window. But if you're still trying to balance keeping a red shirt or not, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. So what Penn State does this week, specifically with Quentin Martin Jr., but also possibly Tyzer Denmark and some other guys, and Corey Smith, if he's in that conversation too, will go a long way in telling us what the Penn State plan is at running back and at receiver moving forward. T. Frank, let's get into some things we're looking to hear from James Franklin at practice tonight. By the way, before we do that, I want to remind you that after practice, you can get the latest notes from the practice field. T. Frank, Sean Fitz, Nate Bauer will have the latest and greatest insight and intel from the practice field. And then we'll have complete coverage over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, and you can sign up today. Promo code PSU1. You get 2 months of access for just $1 with promo code PSU1. If you think about where 2 months is going to take you, it's going to take us into, all the stuff that happens in December, whether it's the college football playoff, whether it's the transfer portal, whether it's class of 2025 flips and things like that. So you want to get all the new and latest intel and insider info at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Use promo code, PSU1. It's gets you 2 months for $1. T. Frank, James Franklin talks tonight. Yeah. These Wednesday news conferences, I think we are either 3 or 4 or 4 or 5 here in terms of the first question being injury related.
Yep.
James Franklin, if you didn't watch the YouTube video here about James Franklin's Monday news conference, he started it off sort of detailing his way of going about sharing injury information publicly. And one of the things he said was, once he gets that information, which usually takes longer for him to have than you might think, he has the conversation, obviously, with the player and his family and all that. And then he said, sometimes I have the answers, but it's not time for me to have a discussion with the player or his family or both about sharing that information with the media, with the public. So that's why sometimes you might think you see something on game day and you're like, well, that's obvious what happened. We're going to find out about that Monday or Wednesday of the following week. And it doesn't always work out that way. So point being, injury questions about the guys we mentioned so far, any kind of an update on KJ Winston Jr., all that stuff could come up. I just, at this point, not expecting much. And I think that James Franklin would just do himself a favor if he would say, here's how I'm going to do this. When I have the info and it's ready, I will start whatever my next news conference is with it. And that would just take all the, ambiguity or whatever you want to call it out of play.
Yeah, so it's just interesting. Like, basically, what that conversation boiled down to was stop asking. Like that's what it was. Right. Because there has been this new rhythm where James Franklin does not talk about injuries, and you wrote about this a couple weeks ago of the nature of the way he's discussed this over time. That it's actually more of a detriment when there's a long-term injury, guys out for the year or for an extended period of time that might consider a year-ending injury. That he doesn't want to take the questions week after week after week. So he will announce when those are a long-term injury. So everyone phrases every injury question as, is that a long-term injury? And now he's been backed into this particular corner. So now he was trying to find a way out by saying, hey, basically don't ask over the first week of any particular injury. And I'm interested to see what the next chess move is by the people who want to get that information. Like, how you're right. Like, are there follow-ups to a long-term injury discussion? It is both interesting and completely unimportant to Penn State fans and to this process of gathering information from James Franklin on injuries, which is kind of like trying to fish without bait. It's just like it's not a very fruitful thing. What are you interested to hear from James Franklin? And do you have any questions you want me to ask him, by the way? Oh, but I'm fielding requests.
Well, I think one of the things you have here, I want to actually get to this next thing you have on the rundown because it's a good transition. But you mentioned James Franklin has talked in recent weeks about needing to have more plays on offense to get more people the ball and things, so on and so forth. And so the question you have here is that topic going to come up again? Penn State, as we sit here today, is 72nd in the country with an average of 67 plays per game. Not a huge sample size, but we do have 4 games worth of info telling us that. The leader, by the way, is Arkansas with 80. There's 3 teams in the country over 80 and right around 50 who have over 70 plays per game. So that gives you any indication of where Penn State's at. What made you think that could come up, or what did you learn since that topic first came up like 2 weeks ago between now and then that makes it of interest possibly tonight?
Here's the problem. If we go back to this last game, that was Illinois playing a slow tempo and playing a lot of running the ball control, all that stuff. Penn State does that too. So they're never going, they're not an up-tempo team. They're not a no-huddle team. They are not going to lead the conference, let alone the nation, in plays. But it's more about getting quality plays, quality targets, quality reps to the players that need them to get them established within the offense. And I think for the most part, they did that against Kent State, and then they did that early against Illinois. And this is kind of the way that I've been looking at this in terms of what are you trying to do within the offense and what players fit that best. So Tyler Warren is the team's number one target getter, number one receiver, however you want to phrase that. Sure. Trey Wallace is 1B. They're not scheming as many things, I would say, for Trey Wallace as like he's going to get open and we're going to throw him the football within the structure of the offense. But when you're going against a team that you want to attack down the field, there's a couple of players that you'd use in those situations. Again, Tyler Warren is the number one target getter in this offense, but Amari Evans is kind of next up in that conversation of when we want to be aggressive, they're going to design shot plays for Amari. But that leaves out Liam Clifford and Julian Fleming. And of course, whenever Caden Saunders comes back into the fold, like there has to be a conversation about is he 100% and does his athleticism warrant design? So in this last game, they were throwing underneath. This is a very long way to say this last game, they were throwing short and wanting to catch and run. That is more Liam Clifford and Trey Wallace than it is Amari Evans. So this week-to-week conversation about who's getting targets and are the receivers getting enough targets, it is entirely based on what the offense is trying to do. And you're not going to get a steady diet of the same receiver week to week to week unless it's Trey Wallace. And so, like, I don't think they established receivers in the offense necessarily because Illinois didn't allow them to. They didn't play the coverages they were expecting. And so a lot of those targets and catches just kind of went for 4 or 5 yards. And that is less impactful than if you are getting a guy to catch the ball and run for 15.
No question about it, T. Frank. One last thought as we get into the next part of the show. You're listening to the BWI Live Show on Wednesday, October 2nd. Of course, I lost it here. Oh, here it is. Doesn't our history of not releasing injury information predate Franklin? Yeah, it does. I mean, it predates almost anyone currently coaching in college football because it's been like outside of Kirk Ferentz because it's been like that forever. The difference now is that you have a game day availability report in the Big Ten. The SEC has a availability reporting system that starts on Wednesday or Thursday and goes through the weekend. So more and more you're starting to see this stuff come out in different ways, in ways that it never did before, which I think is probably part of the reason some coaches sometimes find themselves in a weird spot of wanting to do things the way they always have, but also realizing that, especially in the SEC, not so much currently in the Big Ten because James Franklin does not talk until after that report comes out on Saturday. But, you know, if you're a coach holding a Wednesday news conference in the SEC and a guy's not at practice, you know, you can choose not to answer a question about it, but then you got to put that report out sometime that evening. So, you know, it's going to come out one way or the other. All right, T. Frank, let's roll along to the
quick question.
You got one more thing? Yes.
Yeah. Just, I want to ask you this, like, do you think the more prevalent sports betting becomes on the college level and across the country, is that an area where then those injury updates become mandated? Do you think that there's a future where as this becomes more professionalized, the conversation of protecting these kids, because that's what James Franklin's whole thing is, being sensitive to an 18-year-old's medical history and his current, like, almost like a HIPAA level of thing. So do you think that if the more the sport is professionalized, the less there is for that as a leg to stand on, which really what it is we want to obscure the injury information so that guys that even are banged up, you don't know about, and you have to guess when you're watching film, so you don't know who to attack and how to attack.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's certainly the sports betting part of it is certainly in the equation. I don't know if there's some other factors at play there. I think that's the easy thing, the most obvious thing to point to, but it feels to me like some of this stuff may be related to other things. What those other things are, I don't know. I haven't spent enough time thinking about it. But yeah, I don't think there's any question that the model the SEC has right now is probably the way of the future, unless the coaches give such negative feedback after 1 year that they decide to change the process they put into place this year. But from what I've read, T. Frank, pretty much unanimously across the board, SEC coaches are okay with this availability report as long as everyone's doing it and as long as there are no shenanigans. And through 5 weeks, that's a pretty, there are some coaches down there, Lane Kiffin, of course, the chief among them, but there are some others who would have no problem calling somebody out if shenanigans were at play with the way an injury report was being given versus the way it actually showed up on game day. So far, so good. And I think as long as that continues to be the case, you are going to probably see that be adopted by, the Big Ten would be probably first in line, but other conferences as well. So, yeah, I definitely think the sports betting angle is part of it, but I just think that, the information flow is just so much greater in a variety of ways across this sport right now, and that's just one of them.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, let's get into the mailbag. Alrighty, mailbag time here on the BWI Live Show on Wednesday, October 2nd. So here's how we're going to do this. There's some questions in the chat. There's some questions we curated from the Lions Den message board over at bluewhiteillustrated.com. So we're going to go back and forth, and we appreciate you guys here on the show. Want to make sure we get to your questions, and I know some of these probably came from yesterday's live show, and so we're going to get to as many of them as we can. So let's dive in here. Let me see where we're going to kick things off first. Cornerback evaluation, T-Frank, is what we're going to look at here. Just looking for overall thoughts on our 6 corners since we focused on the safeties. Rightly so, a good bit recently. Anyone positively surprising you when it comes to the cornerbacks?
This is a great question because there has been a lot of conversation about the snaps and the reps and all those things. And I guess from a surprise point, Elliott Washington playing as much as he has over the last 2 weeks and playing well. Not playing like a superstar, but playing well enough that they can do a lot of different things from an defensive standpoint and maintain what they want to do. So I think that's a huge development because he's a guy that has a lot of talent. And I know that a lot of people look at him as a safety because of some of the parts of his profile, and that has been kind of floated for a while. But having a guy stick at corner is also a good thing. I think we tend to, in this conversation about Penn State and the way they handle athleticism at that position, he's not slow and he is not without talent to play the position. So having more guys be able to play corner is a better thing than having to say like, okay, well, we're just going to move this guy. Cause there seems to be this, I feel like there's a knee-jerk reaction. If he isn't a starter or a star, then kick him over to safety. And I think his ability to stay there so far has been a positive, especially as an outside corner. And that's really important because that's what Penn State needs to have the flexibility to use guys at different positions. So I would say the guy to me that stands out is Elliott Washington. But then the obvious thing is that the transfers came in and took over. A.J. Harris and Jalen Kimber playing as well as they have, being difference makers to seal games and get interceptions and play above what we saw of them previously has been excellent by Penn State. So I think generally they have 3 strong guys, and that separation that we talked about has started where A.J. Harris is starting to look like more and more like the guy in the secondary.
What surprises you more, that Elliott Washington II and Cam Miller are almost identical in terms of snaps this year, or that Jalen Kimber and A.J. Harris are by far the leaders of the snaps at cornerback after 5 weeks?
I guess Cam Miller, because I came into the season assuming seniority within the program, and they've been preparing him to be the starter for a couple of years now. And I'm not saying that they were just going to automatically give it to him, but I assumed those advantages he would be able to stave off some of the competition. And truthfully, that's not how that's gone. We had such a limited sample size that you didn't want to overreact to the bowl game. Right. But the more we watch, the more it seems like from his perspective, he's been good. I think some of the beating him up for some of the mistakes he made in the Bowling Green game is a little overblown, but we don't have evidence to the contrary. Like the play at the catch point is becoming more and more of a thing for him until he reverses that narrative. And so he hasn't had as many opportunities outside as an outside corner to do that. So it feels like he has been moved full-time into the slot, essentially. And that is a surprise to me.
Yep, no doubt about it. All right, one from the chat here. David asked, why does Franklin never seem to mention or take into account the fact that Chase Meyer was 17-20 on field goals at Tulsa last year when bringing up analytics on the kickers? So a couple thoughts there, David. My first one would be that it's pretty clear, at least from listening to James Franklin earlier this year, that I think Chase Meyer missed some time either in spring ball, preseason camp, or both. So that was a factor. There's no doubt about that. But Frank, this kicking conversation is so interesting to me because we have all, at least in my opinion, we have as much game data as we need on Sanders Sahadak over his course of his Penn State career to know that Penn State does maybe not have a consistent option there just based on his career numbers. Mm-hmm. At the same time, to David's point, Chase Meyer, I think all of his kicks were inside of 45 yards at Tulsa, which is fine. Sahadak missed 2 from 40. So if you could get those, that would be helpful.
Right.
But, Ryan Barker's been here now for a second year, got a lot of praise last year. I guess my big question is, again, they track everything, and Sahadak was the guy last year, lost the job to Alex Felkins. He's the guy this year. Ryan Barker replaced him for the extra point. And who's going to take the first field goal attempt, if there is one against Illinois, is obviously going to be something people are watching closely. I think I left last weekend convinced Penn State was going to make a change at kicker. And then the more I thought about it, I don't know if you feel the same way, but the more I thought about it, there's another side of me that says these guys obviously see a whole heck of a lot more in practice than we do. And is Sanders Sahadak, is he too far ahead of those guys, even with the game misses, to try and make a change or trust somebody else to go out there? That's kind of where I'm at with it at this point.
Yeah, and I think kind of reading between the lines of things that James Franklin has said, the first thing is when we had the first conversation, he said it wasn't like there was a big difference between the guys in practice. Sanders Sahadak won the job. He had the highest completion percentage, and then he rattled off like it was within 2 percentage points for each of the kickers within practice. So here's the other thing. Just like in the NFL, first-round draft picks are going to get more of a leash than guys that aren't because there's reasons you invested in that guy. There's reasons they recruited Sanders Sahadak, the leg, the strength, the power that they want to have a weapon to kick field goals from 55+. So he lost the job last year. You give him the opportunity to re-win it. He re-wins it. And now we have evidence in-game, again, in-game evidence is gold, but we all get it at the same time. So James Franklin's making these decisions and getting this information in real time too. I agree. I think after, what he said this past week of, that in-game evidence is new information and it obviously is going to come into play. Yeah, I think that Sanders Sahadak is getting the hook and they're going to try and move on to a different player because now the evidence is built instead of they're giving him another chance to win the job and go out and believe in the guy, give him the support and confidence they think he needs to go succeed, and it still hasn't happened. So now you do have the conviction to make a change.
No doubt about it. All right, next question on our list is going to look ahead to UCLA week. This one comes from the board, I believe. What do you most want to see from the team this week before we enter into the toughest stretch of the schedule? So Penn State faces UCLA this week, goes to USC next week, has a bye, and then goes back on the road to Wisconsin. So this is actually a question I was going to ask you earlier. I'm glad it's here, but I'm going to phrase it in a similar but slightly different way to tie back to our Kent State conversation. UCLA is not as bad as Kent State. But UCLA is a team Penn State should handle fairly easily based on everything we've seen so far. So what do you want to see and what defines success for Penn State on Saturday?
Don't wait to win the game.
Yeah.
And so this is another way of saying slow start, but I really want you to go read the article I wrote because there are some pretty specific things. I did a little bit of some light reporting about some of the things going on at halftime for Penn State, and I think this team needs to get a killer instinct. I don't know that they have a killer instinct on offense specifically. And that is something they're going to need because the gist of what James Franklin said is you let Illinois hang around too long. So I went and broke down exactly where they had the opportunity to put that game away and where they missed on those opportunities. So to me, when you have the opportunity, take it and don't miss. And that's the ball game for me. Because if Penn State is able to do that, this offense is unbelievably hard to defend. And so that's That's the major thing they need to do so they're ready for USC. Because if you are dominant, if your defense is in a position where USC's offensive line is not up to task, that's my anticipation. And you have that advantage, and your defense gives you that advantage, and then you go and don't convert early in the game, and you say, okay, that's all right. We got the second half. We can make halftime adjustments, blah, blah, blah. They've got a good enough quarterback to make you pay for that. So don't give them the opportunity. And that's the major thing for the Penn State offense specifically that I think they need to learn.
Yeah, I think for me, it's exactly what you don't want to see what we saw against Bowling Green, which, look, I get Bowling Green played Texas A&M very tough a week after it played Penn State, or 2 weeks after it played Penn State, rather. Then it lost to Old Dominion. So, I'm going back and yeah.
Can you put up the second to last point in the chat?
Yes, I can do that. So that's I think, is it this one you're looking for?
That one.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
A field goal is, and I know that this is fair, where if Penn State this is part of taking the chance, like not missing your chances. Against good teams, field goals are they're a consolation prize on a failed drive. You need touchdowns. You need to put the pressure on the other offense. A team like Illinois, where you drive the ball 13 plays for 6 minutes and you settle for a field goal, that is a win. If you put up 7 points, they cannot overcome that. They can get a field goal. They can drive 20 yards and get a field goal off field position. They cannot drive the length of the field and get a touchdown consistently. So, yes, everyone is piling on Sanders Sahadak today. But to my point is, if you get into the red zone, to the 23-yard line, to the 20-yard line, and you don't score a touchdown, that's the difference between this offense and other offenses that will not let you off the hook for missing open opportunities in those situations. So I see field goals as like a side conversation, a compounding issue. But the real point is they weren't able to take those long drives and convert them into touchdowns, which is how this team becomes suffocating.
That's exactly right. And so that's what I want to see on Saturday. I want to see Penn State be suffocating. I don't want to see a repeat of Bowling Green where the defense had some hiccups and then had to wait till halftime to get it in gear. And the offense, obviously did what it needed to do. But the thing to me is I just want to see Penn State go out and dominate a team that it should dominate. And we saw that against Kent State. Again, UCLA is not Kent State. It's a Big Ten team with scholarship players too. But Penn State's almost a 30-point favorite for a reason. So I think to me, that's the big thing I'm sort of watching for here. And it kind of goes to the same thing you're talking about, the killer instinct and things like that. So to me, you just want to see Penn State do what you expect it to do and be clean and efficient, and please get rid of the pre-snap penalties and, go from there.
Yeah.
So, and that's exactly what T. Frank is saying here. Yeah, field goals do not win games. They can win games at the end when you don't have enough time to score a touchdown.
Yes.
But there's probably a good chance you missed a chance to score a touchdown previously that left you in that position in the first place.
Yeah. And coming up completely empty on those drives is ultimately what makes this such a stark visual of 21-7 when Penn State was dominant in that game. And if you have 30 points, you feel a little better about that. But I think there is still in the Kent State game, I'm sorry, not in the Kent State, in the Bowling Green game and in this Illinois game, I feel like Penn State left multiple touchdowns on the board. And that is not something you can do later on in the season.
T. Frank, next up on our list of questions, it is BWI Live. We're in the mailbag segment of this show. Dakari Nelson started against Illinois and played a fair amount, which was interesting. I'm not sure anyone saw that coming necessarily, at least the starting part of it anyway. But your thoughts on how he played against Illinois and what you think his role will be against UCLA this week?
So this is going to get into a conversation we have a little bit later about these snap counts because it gets like Zion Tracy and Cam Miller are part of this conversation, but it boils down to this. Penn State thought Illinois wanted to run the football. They wanted to take that away. Dakari Nelson is a linebacker, so they're going to play him against linebacker teams. Now, Illinois plays a lot more 3-receiver sets than they did previously when Brett Bielema it was kind of like his show offensively.
Right.
So that is a bit of a difference why it wasn't so dominant even further in Dakari's way. But this is exactly what we're talking about. Without KJ Winston out there, you've got to make decisions of whether you're going to play you're going to play base personnel or nickel, because playing Jalen Reed and splitting the difference is not available right now. So Dakari Nelson played against a run-heavy team, so that's why Dakari Nelson played so much. I thought he played well. And to me, I think that's the most encouraging thing we got out of that game from the defense, outside of, the main talking points, is Dakari was in position, and he was it wasn't too much for him. There wasn't things where it looked like he was lost. So I'm very impressed, and I'm very encouraged about his potential at linebacker long term, not even just this season, because I think we all remember Koa Farmer and the experiment moving a safety to a linebacker. Sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes you don't have those instincts. But I think enough instincts from Dakari that I think this is going to be a positive change for him and his long-term future, and also for Penn State.
No question about it. Last one on our list here, and then we'll see if there's any more in the chat before we move on to the film review and get ready for UCLA. Question focuses on everyone's favorite offensive lineman, freshman Cooper Cousins. Thoughts on the play of Cooper Cousins so far, T. Frank? In the view of Dave, who asked the question, he has looked good, especially in blocking situations.
Yeah, he looked good. So it's different than the starters. And that is not that's just, he's a freshman. So there's like percentages less than the starting offensive lineman, Sal Wormley, who's a 6th-year guard, and Venga Ioane, who is 350 pounds. He's a freshman that's playing like a Big Ten starter, but he's not. Penn State's interior line is very impressive. So he's not quite to that level of, his hand fighting isn't quite as good. His strength isn't quite as good. But when you compare him to other offensive linemen, it's very impressive. So I guess that's the part where I'm like, okay, you get used to a certain level and you see it's like just slightly below that. There's a reason he's not starting, is because those other guys are genuinely better than him right now. But he's starting with such a high floor that you have to acknowledge this freshman is playable. And so it's just, like little things that he's going to learn over time that make him better. And kind of rolling back to the Kent State game where we got to see him a little bit more, saw more mistakes that he then corrected in real time, which to me is the most exciting thing, because that shows you what he does in practice too. That shows you he's got the ability, and why he's in this position he is now is because he can take coaching, can take failure, and correct it and not continue to make the same mistake. Even if he still loses in the situation, he can make the correction and give himself a better chance to win. So those are all really positive signs. Everything about Cooper Cousins is really positive, but we also got to see, okay, the 3 guys in front of him are really good too. And there's a reason we're seeing him as a young freshman who gets in the game late.
Correct. All right, one more from the chat, unless one pops up here as we answer this one. Alex, going back to our field goal conversation, anyone remember the 9-6 LSU-Alabama game? A couple of thoughts there. 2011, different time in college football in terms of offenses and how they played. But what kind of happened in that game? I just pulled up the box score is what we're getting at in this conversation. So Alabama lost that game, right? And it had chances, plenty of them, to get into LSU territory. One field goal it missed. It had 1st and 10 at the LSU 20 or 30. It went backwards, leading to a 44-yard field goal that it missed. Other field goal it missed, had 1st and 10 at the LSU 24, then went backwards, had a 49-yard field goal blocked. And then LSU, later in the game, had a situation where they could have pretty much put Alabama away and, fizzled into, not in goal-to-go territory, but approaching the red zone, and had to settle for, a field goal that at that point in time won them the game. But
aren't those also historically great defenses from what I remember?
It was, yeah, and that's the other side of it too. But, yeah, I just think that the main point to me would be that when you look at games that are lost, there's, look, one stat does not tell the story, but to me, you can often go back to a team, anytime you're kicking for 38 to 44-yard field goals, there's a decent chance you probably had an opportunity to get 1st and goal or 1st and 10 inside the 20 of your opponent. Yeah. And if you turn those into touchdowns, your odds of winning go up. But that goes without saying. So I think that's really the point we're getting at there.
Yeah, and also just because it played out that way doesn't mean that's the result that the team wanted. And I understand, you have to play the game that presents itself, and you have to hit field goals. We're not saying it doesn't matter that they missed the field goals because they didn't get the touchdown. You have to get points on every drive. And it's preferable if Alabama scores a touchdown, game pressure dictates that you can't be as conservative and safe with your play calling if you're the opponent. That's the whole point, is game pressure, time on the clock, and Greg, it's amazing. I go in and I look at some of the data by quarter. The first and the third quarter are different than the second and the fourth. Coaches, by nature, are conservative. They are trying to not lose, and then when time runs out, they have to start trying to win. And so play calling, aggression, run versus pass all change. And so if you put game pressure on the other opponent because you score touchdowns, suddenly they can't be that. And that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back. Actually, it's a great way to end any more Illinois conversation because, James Franklin said, after the game, Monday, and I'll probably say it again tonight, the fact that Penn State allowed Illinois to do execute its game plan and play a kind of game it wanted to for way too long. Not that that's a field goal conversation necessarily, but to your point, it played out sort of that way in the Penn State-Illinois game until Penn State decided it was going to just do what Illinois wanted to do and just do it better. You have homework, T. Frank. There's a barcode sticker still on the bottom of your drink bottle. Could you remove it? It's a pet peeve of bad milk. So you got homework for after the show. Bain Train asked, I know UCLA based on paper and what I've heard isn't good. Anything on the film that says but is that a good time to transition into the final segment of our show? All right, let's do it. I'm going to say no, but we'll get into more details about that here in both the Sunday film study and the final few minutes of today's show. So thanks everyone for being with us. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. Leave us a review if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or obviously here on YouTube as well. All right, T. Frank, Sunday film study time. Penn State UCLA set for noon Eastern time kick on Fox. But before that, we're going to take one last look back at Illinois. And we'll just start with another favorite topic of so many people, and that is Abdul Carter as a defensive end versus a linebacker. Abdul Carter won, I think, pretty much every award he could possibly have won following his big day against Illinois. Your just general reaction to his play and how Penn State used him.
He was excellent, and it didn't matter whether he was lining up at defensive end or at linebacker or mugging the A gap or any of those situations because he was effective. And so, bottom line, his play at defensive end is great. It has been very good and surprising to me in terms of his run defense and his overall ability as a football player from that position, and he's taken to it really well. But the conversation I find interesting is the one about linebacker, and Penn State has to move him around the formation and they have to do X, Y, and Z. And those are always good ideas, but they aren't necessarily indicative of, I'm more interested in how you're using him. And so the way they were using him was the exact same as he's a defensive end, but they just lined him up at linebacker. And so some of the things, he's lining up off ball. He's not playing in coverage from that situation. The reason they did that is because he wasn't playing the zone coverages well enough. So they flipped him and the linebacker so that the linebacker dropped into coverage from his position and Abdul blitzed. So to me, that's saying, okay, Abdul's a defensive end. We're just going to move him around, but his job stays the same. And I just think that's really important to point out, in that he is not going to be taking snaps at middle linebacker or moving back full-time to linebacker because his best skills are attack and not the other things that make a linebacker, I guess.
Penn State, of course, Luke Altmaier had some success and some other quarterbacks have too this season. Not full game success as we've come to see in Penn State. Penn State's perfect start, but your next note here is just on giving up passing yards and how Penn State, may be doing that as a function of setting up to stop the run.
Yeah, just one last quick point on Abdul Carter in third down. An interesting thing from that particular game is because Illinois plays so slow, Penn State was actually able to get their third down defense on the field for the full game for the first time, maybe all season, where Abdul Carter, they've been planning on doing these things with Abdul Carter probably all year, but they just can't get their third down defense on the field because teams aren't allowing them to substitute. So playing over the center, playing that spy position, those are all things that are, again, kind of like defensive end jobs. You're just moving around the formation. So anyway, just last point on that, because it does get into I don't want to say everyone, but a major concern coming out of that game was, well, the corners can't stop anybody. Look at all these completions. Look at all these easy yards. If you're selling out to stop the run and you're playing a team that plays an RPO offense, which means it's a run until it isn't when the quarterback pulls the ball and throws, your corners have to be perfect. They have to be dominant. So does Penn State have a bulletproof, dominant, all-pro at every position on this defense sort of defense? No. But the scheme was, in my opinion, conceding a 7-yard slant so that they could make it 2nd and 12 more often. So the product of Zion Tracy playing, number one, and Cam Miller playing because Jalen Reed is back at safety and not at that lion position, and the style of the defense they were playing, I think that was more a schematic concedence. Is that a word? To
sure,
Illinois.
It is now.
Yeah, as opposed to like, oh, this is a real problem. If they had played zone and they had played a little softer against the run, those slants are not there. They take that particular part away. But they thought it was more important to take away the run and the play action and take the sting out of the play action, which is where Luke Altmaier did all of his work as a quarterback in the previous games. So I think that is, I'm like, coming out of this, I'm not concerned about the corners or the passing defense, is I guess what I'm saying here.
All right, very good. Want to give a shout out to Two Kids, One Wife, all PSU for their super chat donation. We appreciate you being here with us both on the Lions Den message board and here on the YouTube channel. So thank you so much for the kind words and the donation.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Snap counts. So everyone loves snap counts. That's where we're going next. Just take it and run, T. Frank. I'm going to press buttons while you talk. So go ahead.
Yeah. So the Dejon Lane conversation. I think it was it was interesting watching how all of these things played out. And I think that the real conversation about Dejon Lane and where he's playing comes back to how comfortable they feel with their safeties at that boundary position. So this is how it works. Jalen Reed is now the boundary position, the boundary safety, taking over for KJ Winston. James Franklin has talked about how they really want to get they want to get Dejon Lane up to speed so they can move Reed back to underneath coverage, move him around the formation more. But Dejon Lane has only played the field safety, which is the one that is more of a free safety. It's more coverage oriented. You're playing a little more preventative than you are involved in the run game. That comes back to me of like Zakee Wheatley has to take a step. This is less about Dejon Lane and more about Zakee Wheatley as a run defender and as the guy who would have to take over that role for Jalen Reed to then move back to the Lion. So the reason we did not see Dejon Lane is because they probably trusted Dakari Nelson more, and they only got to putting that particular combination on the field 6 times in the game. I think we see it more against UCLA because that's where they want to get to ultimately. But after watching Zakee and some of his struggles to fill in the run game, it's a concern. I don't know that it's going to be something they're able to do unless the light comes on for Zakee in those situations. He's talented enough to do it. That's the thing, is like he is big enough, he is fast enough, he has the maturity to do it. It's just something that's got to click for him. And then when it comes to Cam Miller and Zion Tracy, and people were asking what's the rep count there? Essentially, they're splitting the reps between those two players, which I think, again, says what the job Zion Tracy has done and what's happening with that conversation around Cam Miller. So just going into those snap counts, you've got that 11th defender. How are you planning to play that role? I think it's muddied a little bit because of the boundary safety and if you could clone Jalen Reed, the problems would be over. Like you play him at both spots and then you can cycle in Dejon Lane, but they just can't do that right now. So I think that's kind of the setup for this game, where I think you'll be a little more confident to play Zakee Wheatley at that boundary position, and you can try in this game to set up more of what you're going to do against USC in the coming week and get everyone reps in that new defensive alignment.
Yeah, the one thing I would point out, I think if all things were equal and the way UCLA wants them to be, what you just said there is spot on. The question I have is that Ethan Garbers, the starting quarterback for UCLA, is dealing with an injury coming out of the Oregon game. They've tried to make it sound like so far this week that he's going to be okay to play. If he is not, and we're going to hear, check BlueWhiteIllustrated.com later on Wednesday, we're going to hear from UCLA coach Deshaun Foster, the latest update on this situation. But if they go with Justin Martin, that offense, and it has a terrible running game, but it's going to turn into an Illinois, I think. Justin Martin's thrown 5 passes in his college career, former 4-star, but they have not unleashed him as a quarterback. There's a reason for that. He didn't even win the number 2 job coming out of preseason camp. They have like 7 quarterbacks on the roster, and they were all below the line to be named the second backup. Somebody had to, so it was Justin Martin. But from what I've been able to read and listen to, it does not sound like he took control of that job in such a convincing way. So that could possibly change. To your point, T. Frank, I think Penn State would probably like to do some of the things you're talking about. Will the game plan UCLA is either deciding to use or forced to use allow them to do that? It's kind of something I'll be watching for this weekend.
Yeah, for sure. And again, that comes back to the conversation about your opponent now dictating the players that play, because you don't have the fix-all of Jalen Reed plays that position, end of story. So it is going to go week to week in terms of how they're going to roll out a defensive game plan. And that's the weakness, because there are teams. The question here is like, how does it impact USC? USC's run game is really like the thing that's missing, and why Lincoln Riley got that job is because his RPO offense, the way they're able to challenge teams with a strong run game paired with attacking with good quarterbacks and opening up big windows. If you have Jalen Reed down there, you feel better than if you have a corner, a slot corner, a guy who's sub 170 or around there. So there are teams that will challenge you that you need to have both available. And is Dakari Nelson a good enough coverage player that you feel confident against the slot attack from USC? So it's not just about pass first. It's about what are the challenges they present you from that balanced perspective.
Speaking of pass first, Penn State was not pass first against Illinois, and it led to some very good run blocking for the Nittany Lions. We're going to dive into the how well Penn State did, who performed well, and T. Frank, the list that you have here for us starts with Anthony Donko.
Number one pass run blocker from this past game, a dominant performance. As dominant I've seen from a Penn State offensive lineman maybe since I started doing this, where a lot of times we talk about pancake blocks, and what it comes down to is somebody tripped, right? So maybe you got a good push, but then somebody's leg whipped somebody else in the ankle and they fall over. Anthony Donko moved guys off the ball at an alarming rate. And so we've all seen the potential there for him to do that, and it has not been consistent week to week in terms of the domination side. He's been good this whole time. But this past week, I think it was number 56, the defensive end who plays right over the tackle. He had no chance. Anytime that they ran a pulling scheme towards Donko's side, that guy moved 4.5 yards every time. So I just, in a game where they dominated in the trenches, these guys don't get a whole lot of shine for their work, because it's like, well, look at Nick Singleton running, or look at Katron Allen running. And it's like, these guys are a huge part of that. And one of the reasons they were able to be as dominant and win that game and put together 13 play drives is because when they needed 5 yards on the ground, they got 5 yards on the ground, and Anthony Donko is a huge reason why.
So was Khalil Dinkins, backup Penn State tight end, who had some very noticeable blocks when you went back and watched the tape. He is second on your list of graded run blockers from Penn State, Illinois.
Yeah, and so this isn't a PFF grade. This is just all guys that I thought were good. This is just he surprised me, honestly, because James Franklin has said he's a guy that you can't just put into the bucket of that's a receiving tight end. This is a guy who can do both, and we had not seen it. He has not been healthy or used in that way. And when Tyler Warren is in the Wildcat, he's taking over that inline tight end role. Coming into this season, I expected Andrew Rapplier to be that guy and Dinkins to kind of be like an H-back. Right. Dinkins lined up in line, and part of it is he was lined up next to Donko, and they were blocking together. But when he got to linebackers, he made a legitimate difference the way that I have not seen consistently from him, but also generally from Penn State tight ends. This group is pretty good at run blocking, and I think part of it is the opponent. Part of it is Andy Kotelnicki, and part of it is, they've taken a step in terms of their ability in this particular area. So when a guy like Khalil Dinkins, who was, I think we all thought of as the receiving tight end, to have that particular performance, it stands out. And it was something that he deserves credit for publicly for his performance.
Left tackle Drew Shelton, next on your list of A-plus run blockers from Penn State, Illinois. What stood out about the way he played, first year starting left tackle for Penn State, who obviously has had plenty of experience over his time with the Nittany Lions?
It was a performance I wasn't expecting. And I know I just said that about Khalil Dinkins, but I had evidence to the contrary when it comes to Drew Shelton and his run blocking inconsistencies throughout the first 3 weeks of the season. This was a test game for me. I wanted to see how he would play against a team that was well coached. Maybe some players at those positions didn't have his level of ability, but they were not going to give it to him easy. And he took it from them. So, in terms of most impact blocks, he was second behind Anthony Donko. So coming into, again, these guys are performing above expectation, but when you come into this and it's Drew Shelton, who we saw against West Virginia not perform to the level you wanted in some of those run blocking situations, I was super impressed. And again, as a pass blocker, I thought he did really well. Like, he has improved. I'm wondering, I'm always interested in the timeline it takes from a guy who's cleared to play to when you're actually back. Like, when are you back to yourself post injury? And it takes longer, I think, than a lot of people really think it does. So he was cleared in June. If he's rounding into form in October, I think that's a really good sign, because they need that from him. And if that's the case, again, we have to see this week and the week after, but that's a positive step that I was looking for, and I saw from him for sure.
Last on the list, certainly not last in the minds of many Penn State fans, including, of course, head coach James Franklin, tight end Tyler Warren.
He just has every once in a while a block where you go, oh, damn. And he had one where he destroyed, I think it was number 17, the defensive end. He had a rough night. It might have been number 9. Either way, those guys got rocked by Penn State's tight ends and running backs. So just wanted to put it out there again that he was very impressive as a run blocker. He might have actually lost more than Dinkins in terms of, like, he gave up a couple of tackles in the run game, but his highs are highlight worthy. So Tyler Warren gets onto the list, surprisingly, and for me, number 4 from the way he performed, but still a standout run blocker. When you're talking about a team that ran for 250 yards, the tight ends being involved in that, I think, is super important. Also, Venga didn't quite make the list here, and I think part of it is he was playing right guard instead of left guard. He's been a dominant blocker on the left side. He just didn't get enough opportunity with Sal Wormley being down to play on the side I think he's most comfortable in.
We're coming down the home stretch of another edition of BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickel. Join us, Sean Fitz, Nate Bauer, and Ryan Snyder over at Blue White Illustrated for premium team and recruiting insider intel. Use promo code PSU1 at sign up. That's promo code PSU1 at sign up at bluewhiteillustrated.com to get 2 months of access for just $1. Like we told you earlier in the show, it's going to take you into the most exciting part of the season. So sign up today at bluewhiteillustrated.com, where you can use promo code PSU1 to get 2 months of access for $1. T. Frank, a couple minutes left here on this edition of the show. I know we have some notes on the rundown, but I guess let's just do this kind of rapid fire as Penn State gets into UCLA week. Again, we're going to learn more about UCLA quarterback Ethan Garber's status for the game. I think someone said it in the comment section. Yes, Rob did. There's no way Garber's ankle will be near 100%. I agree. I don't think he's going to play. If he does play, it probably ain't going to take long for someone to chase him and make him run fast enough that ankle becomes more and more and more of a problem.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to see, at minimum, backup Justin Martin. And again, they have other quarterbacks on their roster that they're probably going to have to get into at some point too. But, I mean, you look at the statistics of this team, T. Frank, one of the worst in the country on offense and in defense. Yep. And that's not a great thing when you're
not
coming
a great combination
across multiple time zones to start a game against a top 10 team when your body thinks it should be 9 a.m.
So the main thing, I'm still today after the show, I'm going to start digging into the defensive film for UCLA. I've gotten through 2 games with their offense and I watched a little bit of them against Hawaii, and I'm not, obviously nobody's impressed. I'm not impressed, but specifically, and I just want to get this out here as early as I can in the week, this is going to be another Zane Durant game. This is going to be another Abdul Carter game. Those 2 guys specifically with the tackles and the interior players, number 66 for UCLA, the right guard, I think he's on the same level actually maybe even a little bit better than the Illinois offensive line interior, but he's on that level of Zane Durant should be able to push that guy around and make some definite impact plays. And then from the tackle perspective, their left tackle, I think it was in the last game against Oregon, was in and out as well. So Abdul Carter, no brainer. That's going to be a big game from him as well.
No doubt. T. Frank, you mentioned what you're working on this week at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. What else should people be watching for ahead of kickoff?
Yeah, practice notes. We're going to be getting into some of those things. And again, join BlueWhiteIllustrated.com on the message board, because really what I'm looking for, the things that I want to know, I can't talk about. Honestly, I can't talk about those things because they involve the scheme and what we're expecting from Penn State in this particular game. I can talk a little bit more on the message board, some light sprinkling of some ideas, but you should join us so you can get that information as we see it from practice tonight. So that's the major thing. And then, of course, we'll have more previews of UCLA coming up Thursday and Friday.
Well, here on the YouTube channel, you can watch James Franklin's press conference tonight at Haluba Hall. T. Frank, Ryan, and Sean will be back on Thursday with the recruiting show and more UCLA talk. And as always, you can find us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Don't forget that promo code. It's PSU1 to get 2 months of access for just $1. T. Frank, we made it through another week. Everyone that joined us, thank you so much. We will talk to you soon. And don't forget, get the latest Penn State news over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. We'll see you next week.